Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Josie, and I'm part of the public engagement team here at Alzheimer's Research UK, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Lab Notes event. We are very excited today to be joined by Dr. Louise Kelly, Dr. Jake Brooks, who will share their fascinating research into the links between air pollution and dementia. And we'll also be joined today by Dr. Susan Mitchell, who is Head of Policy here at Alzheimer's Research UK. And Susan will be joining us for the Q&A section of today's event. But first, just before we get started, I'll go over a little bit of housekeeping. So, during the event today, you are welcome to switch on the automatic subtitles using the CC button at the bottom of your screen. They're not 100% accurate during the live event, but Zoom is getting better and better at the live subtitles. The subtitles will be edited so they are correct on the event recording, and we can also send a transcript of the event if you would like that as well. During this event, if you would like to ask a question, you need to click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which will bring up the Q&A box where you can type your question. Please do submit your questions throughout the event, and we will ask them to our speakers at the end. If you are having any technical difficulties, you can use the Q&A button to let the team know. So now we're going to ask you a few poll questions, because while we can't see you due to the online format of the event today, we're really keen to know a little bit more about you. These questions ask about your reasons for attending today, to rate your current knowledge of dementia research, and whether you've attended one of our Lab Notes events before. So you should be able to see those questions on your screen now. So the first one is, how would you rate your current knowledge of dementia research? The second question is, which of these best describes your reasons for attending the event today? So perhaps you might have dementia yourself, perhaps a friend or a family member has dementia, perhaps you care for somebody with dementia, you might work in a field related to dementia, you might not have a personal connection, but just be interested in finding out more. And finally, is this your first dementia research event? So have you been to one of our Lab Notes events before? Have you been to an event in person before? We're really keen to hear. So I'll just give a couple more seconds for a few more of you to answer those questions, and then we'll be able to share those with you straight away. So we'll just leave 5 more seconds for you to submit your answers. And then that should be appearing on your screen. So most people would say they have an average knowledge of dementia research. Hopefully you can learn a bit more today. A variety of reasons of why people are here today. Most people have a friend or family member with dementia. Thank you so much for joining us. And most people have been to an event before, so that's great. Welcome back. And for those of you who are new, welcome. We hope you really enjoy it. So just a little bit from me in our introduction today. So Alzheimer's Research UK is the UK's leading dementia research charity, but we need to work together with key policy and decision makers in order to make a real difference for people living with dementia and their families. Next week, on Wednesday, the 6th of September, we're hosting an event in Parliament to launch our brand new policy report, and we need your MP to attend. The event will give MPs the chance to talk to us about our report, hear from people with lived experience of dementia, and find out how they can support our calls in Parliament. MPs are much more likely to attend if they receive a request from a constituent. So that's why we're asking you to send them a personal invitation. This event is next week, so please do invite your MP to attend today. You can use the QR code or find the link on the website below, which will take you to our website, which will help to draft an email that you can then send over to your MP. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to be joined today by Dr. Louise Kelly from the University of Southampton, Dr. Jake Brooks from the University of Warwick, and Dr. Susan Mitchell, who is Head of Policy here at Alzheimer's Research UK, and she focuses on prevention, early detection and diagnosis. As I said before, you can submit your questions at any point during the event, and we will try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have. Just to say, we can't provide clinical advice in response to questions about individual situations. So please do get in touch with our Dementia Research info line or your GP if you have any specific or personal questions. So that's it from me. I'd now like to hand over to Louise, who's going to start our talks and share some of her fascinating research into air pollution and dementia. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Okay, so today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we know so far about pollution and dementia, and a little bit about pollution in the UK, and then finally about my research, which I'm very excited to talk about. So air pollution is a mixture of gases and particulate matter. So the gases are probably things that you've heard of, things like nitrogen dioxide and ozone. And then there is also particulate matter, which is categorized by size. And in general, the research shows that the smaller those particles are, the worse they are for our health. So the good news is that over the last 50 years or so, there has been a general trend of decreasing emissions. So this graph shows a decreasing emissions of PM10 and PM2.5, so two sizes of particulate matter since 1970, which is great. DEFRA, who monitor pollution levels in the UK, and set the recommended exposure limits, they actually have a pollution forecast, which allows you to see what pollution is going to be like in your area. And on any given day, in general, the map of the UK will look something like the map on the left-hand side of your screen, which indicates that the UK is experiencing low levels of pollution. Sometimes we do have a day like in March 2022, where England and Wales experienced higher levels of pollution, but thankfully this is rare. So in general, DEFRA considers our pollution levels to be quite low. The World Health Organization disagrees. The World Health Organization recently revised their recommended exposure limits, and now 99% of the world lives in an area of pollution, in an area where the pollution is too high. And to put this into a global scale, so my source IQ Air, they ranked 131 countries from highest to lowest pollution. And people are often quite surprised when I tell them that the UK is actually 101 out of 131, which means that there are 100 countries with higher pollution than us and 30 countries with better pollution. So on a global scale, we are doing pretty well, even if we do breach World Health Organization limits. So I'm sure you've all heard about the effects of pollution on our health. It can affect you throughout your life, from pregnancy, childhood, in adulthood, and also in the elderly. And of course, today I am going to talk about dementia. So I'll briefly describe what dementia is. Dementia is an umbrella term which describes a collection of symptoms. And the symptom that comes to mind, first of all, is memory loss. But there are other symptoms, for example, changes in personality. The most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a picture of a brain. Half of it is from a healthy brain and half a brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease. And you can see by the time Alzheimer's becomes advanced, the brain becomes quite shrunken. And that's because the cells, the neurons of the brain are dying. One of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's is the accumulation of amyloid beta. And there are lots of other changes which occur in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, but I talk about amyloid because that is what my research is focused on. So the picture on the bottom right-hand side of the screen shows these black clumps, which is amyloid beta, which has accumulated into what is known as amyloid plaques. So we've known for a while that exposure to pollution does seem to increase your risk of dementia. But we didn't know whether it was the pollution itself that increased the risk or if it was just other factors. But recently, last year, a report was published which summarizes pretty much everything that we know so far. And the authors concluded that there is enough evidence to suggest that, yes, pollution itself does increase the risk of developing dementia. There have also been attempts at these systematic reviews and meta-analyses to kind of combine all the data. And I've put an example there. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So there's a lot we still don't know. We don't know how much pollution you need to be exposed to. We don't know how long we need to be exposed for, not really. We don't know how much we need to be exposed to increase our risk of developing dementia. We also don't fully understand exactly which pollutants affect the brain, but the systematic review and meta-analysis, which I have on the screen, this summary of the current data did conclude that those very small particles that I talked about, they're called PM2.5, they do seem to increase the risk of developing dementia. And there's some evidence that possibly nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide can increase the risk. But I think there is still a lot more that we need to learn. So other things that we don't know, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about our theories around this, is how do the pollutants actually enter our brain? How does our brain deal with the pollutants? And how do the pollutants actually affect our brain once they are in our bodies? So the first thing you should know is that your brain is pretty good at keeping things out that it doesn't want in there. You have something called the blood-brain barrier, which is generally effective at preventing things from crossing from the blood into the brain if it's too big. Another thing you should know is that the gases that we breathe in, those pollutant gases, are often chemically changed when they reach our lungs. So the gases themselves probably don't affect the brain directly, at least not in their native form. However, there is evidence to suggest that those very small particles that I talked about can enter the lungs, pass into the blood, and then pass from the blood into the brain. And there is also evidence that those particles can pass into your olfactory nerve, which allows you to smell. So they can pass into your nerve and then from your nerve straight into your brain. There's also some evidence to suggest that the pollutants might not even need to enter our brain at all. There's evidence showing that the blood vessels around your body can be changed after exposure to pollution. And this can have a negative impact on your brain. And this is actually what I'm focused on in my research, so it's something I'm very interested in. So these particles that do get into the brain, what happens to them? Well, there's evidence to suggest that those particles do actually remain in the brain for a long time. So you can imagine what a lifetime of exposure to even low levels of pollution might look like. So as you age, the amount of pollution or the number of particles in your brain may increase. And this could be what increases your risk of dementia. So we don't fully understand exactly how these pollutants affect our brain. It's possible that the particles which enter our brain can cause direct damage, which makes sense. And like I said, there's also the possibility that the pollution that we breathe in can affect our cardiovascular system, which has a negative impact on our brain. And it's actually very likely that it's a combination of both of these factors, which causes a negative impact on our brain. So moving on to my research. So like I said, we are interested in the blood vessels of the brain. And the blood vessels are very important because they help to remove waste, such as excess amyloid, the protein that I talked about earlier, from the brain. So normally the amyloid is removed via your blood vessels in your brain and it's gone and it doesn't build up. But as you get older or in certain circumstances, this process can fail. So this is one of the reasons why amyloid is not removed from the brain. And of course, it builds up, and we think this is what causes those big plaques seen in the brain. So my project is a huge EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, which I'm still in the process of analysing. I have a lot to do still. But my question is, does pollution prevent your brain from removing the amyloid effectively? Because if you're exposed to pollution and it can no longer remove the amyloid, maybe this is what causes the amyloid to accumulate in your brain, and this is what leads to Alzheimer's disease. So like I said, I don't actually have my results yet because I'm still in the process of analysing them. I have a very big data set, but I'm hoping very soon I will. So to conclude, we know that there's a link between pollution and dementia, but we still don't fully understand exactly how they are linked or what the effect of pollution is on the brain. So we definitely need a lot more research to fully understand the risk of pollution to our brains. So if you have any questions, please do type them in the Q&A. But before the Q&A, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Jake Brooks, who is a Race Against Dementia Fellow at the University of Warwick. And today he's going to talk about his research investigating air pollution deposition in human brains.
Thanks, Louise. I will
stop sharing.
Share my screen now. Okay, hopefully that's working. Yeah, we're good. Thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you to the organisers of Alzheimer's Research UK for allowing me the opportunity to present to you today. My name's Dr. Jake Brooks. I'm a research fellow supported by Race Against Dementia and Alzheimer's Research UK, and I'm based at the University of Warwick. And today I'll talk a bit about my project entitled Metal Nanoparticles in Olfactory Bulb, Origins, Impact and Implications for Tackling Dementia. That's due to begin in October this year. So it's a nice follow-on actually from what Louise has just presented. So you all probably know by now that air pollution is recognised as one of the world's most prominent health hazards. And as Louise mentioned just last year, a report published by the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution, an advisory body to the UK government, concluded a likely contribution of air pollution to dementia. And reference to this report is actually at the bottom of my slide here for anyone who's interested in some further reading. So particulate air pollution, small particles in the air, is especially associated with acute negative health impacts, largely because of the capacity of these tiny particles to penetrate our biological defenses. The smallest particulates are known as ultrafine particulates. An illustration here shows just how small these particles really are. So around 900 times smaller than a grain of sand. And you could fit 500 ultrafine particulates across the width of a human hair. So these particles can originate from a variety of sources, including road, rail, and industrial emissions, and often contain metals. So although metals such as iron, copper, zinc, nickel, chromium, amongst others, are required by the body in trace amounts for various processes, when excessive amounts of these metals enter our body, they can be toxic. Because of the challenges in measuring particles 900 times smaller than a grain of sand, they're not routinely measured, but emerging evidence indicates that they may represent a greater threat to public health than has previously been recognized. It's been suggested that ultrafine particulates are small enough to enter the brain directly by the olfactory system, as Louise touched upon in her presentation. So particles may be inhaled through the nose and transported along the neural pathway illustrated here to the olfactory bulb, the region of the brain responsible for communicating smell information to the rest of the brain. And crucially, this pathway is not protected by what's known as the blood-brain barrier, which can be imagined as sort of like an airport security check for the brain. Specialist cells at the blood-brain barrier shield the brain from toxic substances in the blood, whilst ensuring passages of essential nutrients. And as the olfactory pathway is not protected by the blood-brain barrier, it's almost like a backdoor entrance into the brain. So crucially, the olfactory bulb is also amongst the first regions affected by hallmark protein pathology in both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So tau and amyloid aggregates, which you may have heard of already, form in the olfactory bulb of early stage Alzheimer's patients, and alpha-synuclein aggregates form in olfactory bulb of early stage Parkinson's patients. And in fact, in areas of the world where air pollution is extremely high, like Mexico City, research in the US has shown that evidence of tau tangles and alpha-synuclein aggregates in olfactory bulb of subjects under 20 years of age. It's therefore quite plausible that pollution-derived particulates following this pathway into the brain act to accelerate disease progression. So the overall aim of my project addresses an as yet unmet requirement to better describe the biochemical environment in human olfactory bulb, which has been largely underexplored, and to investigate the potential for air pollutant-derived metal-rich particles to contribute to the creation of a toxic environment for the cells in this vulnerable part of the brain. So the objectives of my work are firstly to better define the physical and chemical properties of metal-rich deposits actually within post-mortem human olfactory bulb tissue. And for this, I'll use a range of advanced analytical techniques to really dig into the detail of these deposits at the nanoscale, which includes use of diamond light source synchrotron, which is a particle accelerator facility in Oxfordshire that can be used to generate very intense X-rays around 10 billion times brighter than the sun, which gives us exceptional sensitivity when looking for tiny deposits in human brain tissue. My second objective is to investigate whether such deposits associate with protein pathology in the brain linked to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, such as amyloid plaques, Lewy bodies, and tau tangles. In other words, could the particulates interact with hallmark features of the disease to create a toxic environment for brain cells? And this builds on some of our prior group work in developing these approaches to study Alzheimer's and Parkinson's brain tissue. So an example of this is shown here from some of our prior published work, where we used diamond light source to map various constituents of amyloid plaques isolated from Alzheimer's disease brain tissue. My third objective is to determine the properties that distinguish environmentally acquired metal-rich nanoparticles. So a certain amount of trace metals like iron, copper, and zinc are essential for normal brain function, and nanoscale metal-rich deposits can be produced by biological processes. But distinguishing these from harmful pollutant-derived sources is not trivial, and we'll never really know what kind of effect pollutant particles have if they can't be reliably distinguished from similar metal deposits produced inside the brain. So here I'll use a broad range of analytical techniques, which combines use of the synchrotron with electron microscopy and a unique purpose-built nanoparticle microscope at the Luxembourg Institute for Science and Technology. I'll compare the properties of nanoparticles measured in brain tissue to real-world air pollutant particles collected from air quality monitoring sites around the UK, such as the Birmingham site where I'm pictured here, braving the weather on a typically cold and wet day in Birmingham. My fourth and final objective is to assess the threat posed by metal-rich nanoparticles to cells in the olfactory bulb. So which types of deposits are most harmful? For example, are they only harmful when combined with pathology like amyloid plaques? So these are some of the questions that I'll be addressing here. As this work requires cells to be alive, I'll carry out this part of the study using mouse models in collaboration with current fellow Race Against Dementia fellow, Dr. Emily Lane-Hill, who also works at Warwick. And this is us here posing for the camera, looking at some initial electrical signals from mouse olfactory bulb. So this project will operate at a unique intersection of many distinct research fields, including biochemistry, environmental health, material science, neuropathology, amongst others. So consequently, creating the project team was somewhat like assembling the Avengers, with these leading experts kindly agreeing to lend their expertise to complement each part of the project. So the project will be supervised by Professor Joanna Collingwood, who leads the Trace Metals in Medicine lab at Warwick and contributes her expertise in elemental analysis and specialist tissue preparation. Professor Roy Harrison contributes crucial expertise and environmentally sample particulate, as well as significant influence at the science policy interface as a member of government advisory committees for DEFRA and for the Department for Health and Social Care. So he sits on the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution, which Louise referenced also in her talk. Kindly donated post-mortem brain tissue will primarily be sourced from Newcastle Brain Tissue Resource and also from Toronto Western Hospital, where experienced neuropathologist collaborators Dr. Chris Morris and Dr. Naomi Pasanji will be key points of contact. Dr. Emily Lane-Hill contributes her expertise in delivering material, in this case nanoparticles, into single cells in living slices of mouse brain. And this will crucially enable us to test how brain cells respond to air pollutant like particles in real time. Dr. Antje Biesemeyer will support use of a one-of-a-kind nanoparticle microscope at Luxembourg Institute for Science and Technology for unique analysis of metal isotope distributions. So this will help us to determine the origin of metal-rich deposits in human brain tissue. So this project work is still very much in its infancy and doesn't officially start until October this year, so don't expect miracles yet. However, I will provide a sneak preview of data we recently collected from Diamond Light Source. So this revealed tiny deposits of iron-rich deposits consistent with the iron oxide mineral maghemite in olfactory bulb from a single Parkinson's case. So we still require further analysis to look at the magnetic properties of these deposits to confirm our initial observations. But it's worth noting that this particular iron oxide made headlines recently as the dominant constituent of air pollution on the London Underground. Tiny deposits of other metals, including titanium and chromium, were also evident in olfactory bulb from Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and neurologically healthy control cases. And the presence of these metals raises really intriguing questions regarding their origin, particularly for titanium, which has no recognized biochemical function. In other words, this metal has absolutely no place being inside a human brain. So the next steps will be to confirm the precise form of these deposits to begin to assess possible origins and to investigate whether these observations are consistent across more cases. So the real question then, what is this project going to do for dementia research? So air pollution has for a long time been recognized as a risk factor for respiratory diseases like lung cancer. That's only recently emerging as a clear risk factor for dementia. So as Louise said, there's still a lot we don't know about why this link occurs. Whilst we don't yet have a cure for dementia, environmental risk factors are eminently modifiable. And I know that Alzheimer's Research UK is committed to improving air quality as part of the Healthy Air Coalition. And my project will bolster support at the science policy interface with new data and with collaboration with Professor Harrison. And this may impact policy-driven preventative measures to limit harmful particulate exposure. The project supports identification of new targets to inform the development of metal-targeted therapies, which have shown promise in recent clinical trials, and will also likely improve understanding of the olfactory pathway for nanoparticles entering the brain. And this is already being explored by the medical community as a more direct means for drug delivery to the central nervous system. The unprecedented biochemical examination of olfactory bulb in this project may help to identify new metal-based biomarkers, which could be detected using MRI or biopsy. And the image here shows iron elevation in MS detected using an MRI scan as an example. And finally, the project will provide basis for the design of new long-term epidemiological studies for exploring links between chronic pollutant exposure and accelerated cognitive decline and dementia, promoting wider inclusion of particulate exposure in the dementia research framework. So the time and resource provided by this fellowship will enable me to make real progress in an underexplored area of dementia research. And I'm really excited to develop the novel approach that has the potential to deliver impact across multiple channels and provide fresh insight into how air pollution may contribute to neurodegeneration and really contribute towards a community striving to reduce the devastating impact of dementia on society. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge people and funding bodies that have supported me thus far, my PhD and fellowship supervisor, Professor Joanne Collingwood, and those working in and around the Trace Metals Medicine Group at Warwick, our esteemed and long-standing collaborators, Dr. James Everett and Professor Neil Telling at Keele University, Beamline staff at Diamond Light Source, and funders EPSRC, Warwick Wellcome Translational Partnership, and of course, Alzheimer's Research UK and Race Against Dementia. Thank you for listening. And at this point, I think I'll welcome back Dr. Susan Mitchell and Dr. Louise Kelly to begin the Q&A.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks both to Louise and Jake for, I think, really interesting talks, really focusing on slightly different aspects of how air pollution may influence dementia and its impact. And I'm really struck by this being really emerging research. And also, I think particularly Jake highlighted how it's about bringing together different disciplines of research, which I think is where you get real innovation. So it's a really exciting project. And I think we'll all be really keen to find out the findings of your research in the years to come. Thanks for the questions we've had today, both before the webinar and also live. If you have got questions, don't forget you can add them to the go to the Q&A and add them there. Just to stress again, we don't have any clinical background between the three of us, so we're looking for questions which aren't about specific people's symptoms. First question I wanted to ask to Louise, one of the questions we had before the webinar was just about whether or not research can actually differentiate between the different types of pollution. We've talked about metals, we've talked about traffic, and obviously you get bits of rubber from tyres, and we also know that things like agriculture can also affect on air pollution. Is there anything we can do to actually differentiate between those different sources of air pollution?
There are studies which indicate that traffic pollution itself can increase risk, because some of the studies are designed to compare, for example, people who live next to a busy road versus people who live a bit further away. But it's very difficult to differentiate just using epidemiological data exactly which particles and pollutants are are causing the effect. So I think it's one of those things where we just need to continue to investigate, for example, using cell-based assays or just non-epidemiological data, because it's so difficult to really come to any strong conclusions. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it's taken such a long time to really to conclusively say, yes, pollution is a risk factor, because it's so messy.
Yeah, of course. And I think obviously dementia happens at the end of your life. So you've got your risk factors throughout your life, and you could have exposure to different things at different times, and being able to kind of unpick what happened to you throughout your life is really challenging. Jake, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I could add to that. I think firstly, it's probably important to make a distinction between different types of air pollution and different sources. So the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention broadly classifies air pollution into 6 different categories, of which particulate matter is one, carbon monoxide and lead, nitrogen oxide, I can't remember the others. So these can be distinguished, and they can be distinguished in real time. So when I was at Birmingham Air Quality Supersite, I could see those being sort of separated. I think what the question is probably in fact getting at is the sources of air pollution, as we some sort of got to eventually. And this is, as Louise said, much more difficult. It relies on specific and physical chemical markers, and also some contextual understanding as well. So, for example, iron is common in particulate matter. You couldn't be sure where that had come from a random sample of air pollution, but if it was collected near to a main road, for example, it's more likely that it could have come from brake wear or from engine emissions, for example. So I think, yeah, a lot more needs to be done testing specific properties from sources, and then identifying signatures so that we can know what the exact source of that pollutant is. But it may be something that I can get into more during my project as it develops.
Yeah, you mentioned the fact about trying to find those kind of biomarkers, those ways of identify those different metals. I agree. I think that'll be really interesting. Just talking about kind of metals, one of the questions that came in during your talk was about where do the metal nanoparticles come from, and is the type of metal important? Could you just perhaps respond to that, Jake, please?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this really depends on the sources. So in my presentation, I showed examples of titanium nanoparticles in brain tissue. So titanium nanoparticles are ubiquitously used in industry, and most commonly in the paint industry, for example, because they scatter UV light, and they can improve the brightness and opacity of light, for the same reason they're used in cosmetics and also in sun creams. Chromium nanoparticles, they're used in metal processing for chrome plating, things like that. They're also quite high in diesel emissions. So metal nanoparticles can come from a variety of different sources, including road, rail, industrial emissions. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
It was, and just, is the type of metal important?
Yes. So the precise form of the metal is really important. So to take chromium as an example, chromium-3, which is a specific sort of valence form of chromium, is an essential nutrient. It's required by the body to produce blood cells. Chromium-6, which is just a different form of chromium, basically, is a recognized carcinogen. So being able to distinguish these different forms of metals, not just between iron, chromium, zinc, but the different forms of the same element is really crucial to better understanding their contribution to pathological processes, particularly in the brain.
Thanks, Jake. It sounds complex. Wow. Louise, I don't know, obviously with your research, you're looking at whether air pollution kind of adds to Alzheimer's and dementia risk, and also whether it changes how your brain might clear things like amyloid proteins. One of the questions we had was about, can we distinguish between how air pollution might increase risk as opposed to what happens to people who have dementia and their exposure to air pollution. I wasn't sure if that's something you could comment on.
That is a very good question. And I don't have the answer. But I think it's something that we will hopefully in the future be investigating in more detail. We know that exposure to air pollution can impact cognition and it can have a measurable effect. But I don't know if any studies have been done in people who already have developed dementia, but I think that's a very good suggestion.
Yeah, and I think it's always important, isn't it, that distinction between both dementia risk and people who have dementia. I do think there was a very recent study that I know we commented on as a charity, which looked at how people who had dementia, who were exposed to higher levels of air pollution, it looked like they actually then used mental health services at a greater level. So again, a really a preliminary study which seems to suggest that even when you have dementia, air pollution may exacerbate symptoms. What that means, we don't know. I think it's a starting point. But again, I think it highlights questions we need to answer at this stage and obviously justifies why further research in this area is going to be so important. Again, Louise and or Jake, one of the questions we've had is about that relationship between poverty and air pollution. We obviously know that often people who have less money have less choice about where they live, and often the houses that are accommodation that's cheaper to live in ends up being on busy roads. So how do we exclude the idea of poverty if we're looking at relationships between air pollution and dementia? How do we take poverty out of the picture to make sure we understand what the processes are?
I can briefly answer with great difficulty. I think that's why it took a while to really conclude that, yes, air pollution itself is a risk factor. And I think now we have enough evidence to suggest that people who live in areas of high pollution, they could be from an impoverished background, but they might not be. They are all at increased risk of dementia. That's my understanding of the research. And I think the COMIAP report is actually very interesting to read if you're interested to know how they came to the conclusion, because it basically sets everything out chronologically, all of the research from the 1950s after the London smog to, close to the modern day. I think, yeah, it is difficult to completely differentiate, though.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think poverty is an important topic to bring up, actually, because air pollution as a risk factor really is a form of social injustice, because there are lots of things you can do to reduce your risk of dementia: exercise, eat healthily, etc. But there's not so much we can do about the air that we breathe. I think most of us would like to be in a position where we can simply up sticks and move to somewhere where there's lower air pollution. Most of us can't do that, me included. So having poverty as sort of an exacerbating factor, how we account for that when we're looking at air pollution as a risk factor is difficult. As Louise said, how you sort of control for the other aspects that poverty might be contributing, for example, poor diet, less sort of social inclusion, those sorts of things that can come with poverty as well. I think it's difficult to exclude those as a risk factor, but yeah, I think it's important that we recognise the social injustice level there of poverty as when we're thinking about air pollution as a risk factor for dementia.
Thanks both. I'd agree completely. I think, and this is where, we as a policy team are trying to engage the government on this challenge around kind of health inequalities and injustice for dementia risk. And it's really important. And obviously, inequalities and poverty are associated with a whole range of health conditions. So we're not just talking about dementia here, we're talking about a lot of other health factors. factors. A couple of other questions we had were on that point about what individuals can do. Obviously, you touched on, Jake, the fact that much of air pollution is at a kind of government or even international level. The World Health Organization has air quality targets. Our government has made some commitments. They're probably not as ambitious as we'd like. So there's obviously what we can do to encourage the government to improve air quality. Is there anything that we think individuals can do? And there's also questions within that. One question that's come on the chat is about whether or not things like wearing masks make any difference. I don't know if either of you have got any comments on that kind of personal sort of response, personal choice point. Jake, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I can go there. So one thing you can do is reduce indoor air pollution. So most of us spend more time indoors than outdoors. So potentially indoor air pollution contributes quite significantly to your overall exposure. So things like not cooking using solid fuels, which an alarming number of people do across the world. They cook using wood, or open fire, or charcoal. So using fuels that are clean at the point of use, I should say. So electricity and gas, how they're actually generated at source is a different question. But something that's clean at the point of use can reduce your overall exposure. Louise mentioned it in her presentation. One thing you can do is check the air pollution forecast on the DEFRA website. So this produces a 5-day prediction of pollution in your area, very similar to a weather forecast. And I'd strongly recommend anyone with heart or lung problems, especially to check that resource out. You could choose alternative commuting routes, potentially. This is something that I've been looking at personally on my commute to work. And my project mentor actually is working on the Dyson Breathe London campaign, where they've developed backpacks designed to be worn by school children, which contain sensors that monitor pollution levels that the children are exposed to on a typical route to school, and using them to redesign their sort of routes to school. So whilst these backpacks aren't commercially available yet, there are other portable, even wearable pollution sensors if anyone was interested in monitoring the sort of typical exposure levels on their route to work. On the mask question, I should say that wearing a mask is not currently included in DEFRA's health advice for dealing with air pollution, because most of the most harmful sources, like particulate matter, they aren't filtered out by masks. So it's not currently included in DEFRA health advice. So that's all I can add on that, I think.
Thanks, Jake. Is there anything you would like to add on that, Louise?
That's pretty much what I was going to say. Try
Right.
and limit indoor.
Yeah, and I think within indoor, there is growing evidence suggests that wood burning stoves may also lower your air quality, and that's just emerging research, and I think there's still more to understand around that. But as Jake said, as part of solid fuels, that may be one which people can make a choice about. And I think, again, much of this is about choice and having information to make a decision. You know, we're not suggesting people should never have a wood burning stove, but I think it's useful to understand that actually it does change the air quality in the room.
Yeah.
Sorry, let's think what's next. Let me just check to see what's next in the questions. There was a question, I think, before the event and also online about the relationship between air pollution and MND. I was just going to briefly say, I think there's a very limited evidence around, MND is motor neuron disease. That's it, muscular neuron disease. I think at the moment there was a paper reviewing this in the past 6 months, which suggests the evidence on this is even weaker than for dementia. There may well be some relationship there, and I think you can see a theoretical logic to it. But I think, again, more research is needed. The data and evidence is really limited, and obviously what you need is good data on who's got these conditions and their exposure. I don't know whether Jake or Louise has anything you'd add on that one.
No, my knowledge of MND is quite limited, and I think I've seen the same paper, so I think we just need more evidence. Yeah,
I've seen the 2022 review that was published, I think, in Environment International. It's perhaps the same paper. So far fewer studies have been done on the relationship between motor neuron disease and air pollution when compared with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, for example. So it's difficult, I think, at this point to draw any robust conclusions I should note that the few primary studies that have been done there focused on ALS, which is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the most common form of motor neurone disease, but it's excluding some of the other forms of motor neurone disease as well. So we haven't got that data yet. So it's difficult to speculate, I think, at this point with the data available.
I think the point, Jake, about data is really important. And I think we should still remind ourselves that data in dementia is still very poor. You know, a third of people in England don't even have a dementia diagnosis when we think they might be developing dementia. So that just tells you that when you then start to look at people's risk, actually, you're not even looking at the full picture. So this is where making sure everyone gets a diagnosis, making sure people get involved in research is so important. One question that came up was around, and perhaps Jake, you could answer this, about the industrial environments. And I know you sort of touched on this, but you know, do we anticipate that people who perhaps work in factories where they will have a kind of, you know, occupational exposure may be at higher risk? And is there anything that we can do around that, particularly in terms of kind of metal processing and grinding?
Yeah, there are certainly some jobs where workers are exposed to elevated levels of particulates, especially, which is my sort of area of focus at the moment. For example, construction workers, miners, people who work on the roads, like road patrol officers. And in fact, there have been numerous studies showing that welders, in fact, may be at increased risk of developing a neurological condition known as manganism, which is a Parkinson's-like disorder caused by overaccumulation of manganese in the brain. This is likely coming from welding fumes in that particular cohort. So there are certainly occupational risks. One thing I should note is that a cross-sectional analysis performed in 2020 with UK Biobank data did not show significant link between estimated occupational exposure to PM2.5 and dementia. However, they did note there's a real limitation that it's very difficult to assess occupational exposure on an individual basis because it depends largely on the working practices, as you sort of elaborated in the question. It depends on the length of exposure, it depends on the proximity to the source, it depends on the level of ventilation. And I think working environments do need to be very conscious of this in conducting risk assessments and things like that to ensure that they are protecting the safety of the employees from chronic exposure to particulates, especially given the evidence that's emerged in the last couple of years.
Thanks. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. So one of the questions was, like, there have been a few questions about sort of engaging councils and thinking about what they should be doing to actually measure or improve air quality. I don't know if either of you, I know, Jake, you're at the early stages and you obviously talked about how your research ultimately might help to influence kind of policy and the decision making. Given where we're at now and what we do know, do you think there's anything we could be doing more to make sure that councils or other decision-making bodies are a bit more proactive on air quality, either through measuring or actually setting standards?
You want me to go on that one, Louise?
Yeah, go on. I'll ask you first, and then Louise can follow up.
Yeah, so I'm in the early stages of my project at the moment. So I think I need to do a bit more research before I have a real stake in that discussion. I'm working with Professor Roy Harrison, who actually sits on, I think he's still deputy chair of the Committee on Medical Effects of Air Pollution. The World Health Organization has set guidelines, which is an annual average of 10 micrograms per cubic meter of air. The government have also, UK government also set targets to meet the 10 micrograms per cubic meter by 2040, which I know ARUK are pushing the government to be a bit more ambitious on that, because the EU and the US are both setting more ambitious targets. So I think as UK citizens, we can lobby the government certainly to be more ambitious in setting harsher, more stringent targets, which is very much in our own interest, I think, long term. I don't know if Louise would add anything to that.
To add on that, I've had some conversations with local councillors here in Hampshire, and the unambitious targets are a reason why they can't make big changes. Or one of the main reason is money, because these things cost a lot of money. But yeah, it's very difficult for them to say, well, we want to have this target when, you know, the government target is much higher. So yeah, I think if we can convince them to be more ambitious with the targets, then that will lead to more change locally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think this is where the kind of research you're doing is so helpful, because it actually helps to understand the mechanisms. It helps to start to define, you know, potentially we can better articulate what exposure actually means. And that is so crucial. I think we've seen this with what's happening in London with the expansion of the ultra low emission zone. There's a lot of impact for people, and they're rightly, understandably questioning it as a direct impact on their lives. And that's where having evidence, if it does support it, we can use to show that. I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to ask you both to kind of, as a wrap up, and it doesn't just have to be about air pollution, but given we know this is very much supporting research and thinking about where it will go in the future, I guess my question is, you know, what are you most excited about in the field of dementia research at the moment? Like one sentence answers, please. Louise, do you want to go first?
Well, I personally am so excited that I'm getting very close to actually finishing my analysis and research. So hopefully in a few weeks, I will actually have the results to share with the world. So that's what I'm excited about.
Definitely. There's a lot of slog in research. So to have that moment of getting the results will be really exciting. We look forward to hearing about that. And Jake, what are you excited about?
Yeah, I'm really similar to Louise. I'm really excited to start this long-term project. But as an overall picture, there are currently 141 treatments being trialled for Alzheimer's alone, and over 100 of those aimed at targeting or modifying disease process. So I think we're in a better state than we have been for a long time, and hopefully over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see new treatments coming through that pipeline, which can be painfully slow, I know, but it seems like that there is a sort of chink of light now at the end of the tunnel, with 2 drugs approved since 2021.
Thanks, Jake. I'd agree. I think, and I've worked at Alzheimer's Research UK for almost 9 years. I think what strikes me is we've got more and more building blocks to our understanding of what's going on with dementia. Still a lot of questions, but being able to pull those building blocks together, I think we're going to accelerate our progress and understanding so much more in the next few years compared to where we have done in the past. So it is a really exciting time. Anyway, that is really where we're going to stop now. Thank you both to Jake and Louise for their really helpful contributions. And I think I'm going to pass over to Josie.
Yes, thank you so much, Susan. I'd just like to round off by thanking again Jake and Louise for joining us, and to you as well, Susan, for chairing such a fascinating discussion and Q&A. So thank you all. Bye. And just as we approach 1 o'clock, I'd like to just ask the rest of you a couple of poll questions that we'd love you to answer, just to give us a little bit of a quick insight into how you found today. So if you've got time, do just stick around to answer our polls. So hopefully those will be appearing on your screen now. So just a quick summary. So was the content of the talks today too technical, about right, or too simple? Would you recommend lab notes to your friends and family? And have you learned something new about dementia research today? So I'll just give you all a couple of seconds to answer those questions for us, and leave those on the screen for you to answer. And then, just like before, in a few seconds, we'll share those with you. So you should see those answers appearing any second now. So there we go. So most people said that the talks were about right. That's brilliant. Lots of people would definitely recommend lab notes to their friends and family. That's fantastic. And most people learned something new. That's really brilliant. We really love to hear that. So I've again got a few more slides to share with you, as I know that there were some questions that we weren't able to answer today, and you might have some questions where you might need some more personalised information or guidance on where to turn. Our Dementia Research info line is there to help. They can answer questions and signpost to other sources of information and support, so please do get in touch with them. You may also be interested in finding out about Join Dementia Research, which can match you to clinical research studies taking place in your local area. This is open to anyone over the age of 18, and you do not need a dementia diagnosis to take part in these studies. You can find out more and sign up to join Dementia Research on their website, and our information services team can also answer any questions that you might have about Join Dementia Research as well. We need people living with dementia to share their experiences in order to help get the NHS ready for new dementia treatments once they've been approved. If you have recently been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease, we're really keen to hear from you. So please get in touch with our supporters and families team by emailing stories@alzheimersresearchuk.org. And finally, our work would not be possible without our incredible supporters. You can support our work in so many ways, from donating, fundraising, volunteering, and campaigning. If you've been inspired by the event today and want to find out more, head over to our website to sign up to receive our newsletter, to donate, or to find out more about our work. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we need your help to invite your MP to attend our event in Parliament. There's been lots of talk today about how important it is that we have support from government and those key decision makers in order to make real change for people living with dementia. As I said, this event is next week, so we would love it if you could invite your MP to attend today. You can use that Q&A code or find the link on the website below. And finally, a huge thank you for joining us today. I hope you found it really interesting and useful, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.